going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe
and Amy
Review, and this is our twice-weekly show where we review the Magic stories. And also, for those of you who are in the States and or who are celebrating, Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
We are celebrating with our family. We hope you get to celebrate in whatever capacity you choose with your loved ones as well. And you are always more than welcome to let us know how your holiday was or is down in the comments below. But this week, or today I should say, we are here for the last Brothers War main story with episode 5, As Cruel as Necessary, by Miguel Lopez and Jeff Grubb. So this is the first story that was written by two people. All the other main stories have been written by just Miguel Lopez. This one also had Jeff Grubb listed as a writer as well, or in the byline. My quick review at the top of this one is I thought the story was great, and I think that, not a lot of, like metaphor and things like that. It was, kind of straightforward in terms of giving you information, but it did a very good job at giving you information. There was a lot of cool dialogue between characters, which I love, and it's kind of a must-read to kind of understand what the whole point of the Brothers War being a set is. So for that reason, I think you should go read it.
Yeah, same. I think it's going to be imperative to read this one. So carve out some time if you can.
Did you enjoy it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So yeah, if these quick reviews make it sound interesting to you and you don't want to be fully spoiled by us talking about it, please feel free to check the top link in the description down below. We try to remove as many barriers as possible to get you to be able to read the story if that is something you're interested in doing. And sure enough, that top link will take you straight to the story. And then if you do go to read that story, or to refresh your memory of it, of course, we would love it if you would then come back here and join us, because this show is a discussion. Amy gives her opinions, I give my opinions. Sometimes they differ, sometimes they're the same, but we want to hear from you. Do you agree with what we have to say? Do you disagree? Are there things that we talked about or didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about or hear us talk about? Let us know in the comments down below. Yes, for sure. Especially if we missed something. If there's how did you guys not talk about this? It was the best part. Let us know. Maybe it's something that we glossed over and we shouldn't have. And we should pay, closer attention to that. So, like I said, let us know in the comments down below. Keep the conversation going with us and with your fellow viewers. We really appreciate it. Before we get started, as we go into the holidays, let's do some house cleaning, or housekeeping, if you will. Thank you for being here. We really hope you're enjoying the things that we're doing on this channel and our other channels, Video Games for All and Gluten Free for All, also linked down in the description box below. Yes. We encourage you highly to go check those channels out. And while you're here and or there, please don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. You will get notifications whenever any of our videos come out, like the final JaAR, which will be this coming Monday, or whenever we go live on this channel, specifically every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Today being Thanksgiving, when this video comes out, we are still doing a stream tomorrow, Black Friday. Again, for those who are unaware, these are American holidays, days, whatever you want to call it. And so that's why it's relevant to us, at least. But we will still be streaming on Friday. And in fact, Fridays recently, because usually we just play whatever video game we happen to be playing at the time. This Friday, we will be continuing our playthrough of the original God of War from 2005. People really seemed to enjoy it last week. Yeah.
And that was the first week that we played it. Correct.
So if you missed it, the VOD is up over on Video Games for All. Again, link in the description down below. And people both enjoyed it live and in the pre-recorded VOD. So I highly encourage you to go check that out. And then we would love to have you join us live on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then for those of you who are fans of Magic the Gathering, which if you're here, I surmise you are, on Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern, we play MTG Arena. This past week, we got trounced for a fair bit of the stream. The VOD is up on the channel. You can go watch my misery and revel in it if that's the kind of person you are. No judgments whatsoever. And we'll be back this Monday for more to attempt to redeem myself. We will see if I can do any better at the Brothers War draft format. But enough of that. We got a story to review. So on to the full review itself. This story, I have to say, because of how well the other stories did the lead up to this part, this story, despite the fact that we were in I didn't count this beforehand, but I probably should have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We were in no less than 7 time periods.
Which is a lot for
yes.
one story.
Yes. But we were in no less than 7 time periods at any point, like throughout the course of this story, and it was never confusing, in my opinion.
I have to agree, and I also kind of feel like there's not a lot to say about this story. I feel like the story was straightforward and said its things that it needed to say, and we're just kind of here saying it's good.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's totally fair. Like, I wrote stats down of, like, how many years it was since this story and this one, but, like, that's irrelevant. Like, it didn't really come to pass. It didn't matter necessarily. We do know that Teferi went from 85 AR to 44 AR and then to 69, or no, 69 is when the original stories were episode 1 and episode 2 with Kayla and Tawnos and etc. But when Teferi was like checking, he went to 85, then he went to 44, and then he finally did find the sweet spot in 63. And saw the Silex blast happen, and then got shoved back to the present, and then had to go back again, but because he had found it, it was easier for him to get back to it again the second time. And that's when he was able to kind of do the crux of the story, which we'll get to in a minute. One thing that I thought was interesting at the start of this was Teferi kind of taking the time to mentally pass the torch. Right? He talked about Kaya. And he said, you know, it would be okay if something happened to me here. Because Kaya would lead. And they have good, like he was talking about how good the Planeswalkers of today are versus from his time.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that, you know, folks like Kaya, Elspeth, Jace. So those 3 got the shout out from Teferi, basically. As Planeswalkers that he believed would be good to step up and kind of take over leadership, if you will. I also think it's kind of interesting because back when we had the Gatewatch more prominently displayed, they still exist, but back when they were the focus of every story, there was kind of the struggle back and forth between Gideon and Jace in terms of who would lead, who would be listened to, who had the better ideas, whatever. And then it kind of had to get scrapped because Gideon had to die.
Stupidly.
Yes. But, you know, we're not really here to talk about that, but yes. And then Teferi took the oath, Johnny, Kaya, etc., right? So there are new Gatewatch members now. But it's just funny that because of this current conflict and Teferi's age and knowledge of the conflict, Teferi just is by default the leader. He's just like, well, I'm the leader and I'll pass the torch down to these people. And it's like, yes, Teferi, you're an old walker. You've been doing this for a very long time and protecting the multiverse for a very long time.
Right.
For sure. But when it comes to the Gatewatch, you're new,
right,
dude.
You're
like,
the newbie.
Yeah, like realize
Not the newbie, like there are other newbies too, but you're one of the newbies.
Yeah. And unfortunately, because we don't have the stories being written the way we did back then, where it was focused on the same pool of characters every time, so we could see their character growth go up and up and up.
Right.
I would be surprised if we heard more about
that progression.
Well, more about the other Planeswalkers reacting to Teferi kind of either by default taking over leadership or kind of coming in and taking over leadership. Especially because since things are on Dominaria, you've got Teferi's friends, like Joyra, Karn, Joda, Jaya, etc., who would by default listen to what he had to say, as opposed to Jace and any other Gatewatch members coming up and saying, hey, by the way, we're working on this kind of big issue, so can we plan this out? Let's figure it out. And all of them would just be like, well, you know, whatever Teferi says. It's like, all right, I guess. So I found that interesting, that he was kind of mentally passing the torch, and it's like, again, overall for Magic Story, totally get it. But when it comes to the Gatewatch, they already did that, right? Like it's important and it's symbolic. So I'm not trying to minimize what he was doing. I just think it's funny that he had that mindset of like, yeah, it's fine. I will be the one to say that it's okay. If I'm gone, they will lead. It's like, they've already been leading. They had like a whole group. They dealt with this whole situation.
Later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's much less of a Gatewatch thing and much more of a old Walker to new Walker thing.
Sure. Because Teferi was all-powerful for a time period, and so he would take over being in control of whatever at any point, because who was better than him?
Right. Because he just assumes that responsibility, because he assumes that he's better than everybody else.
Right. And yes, and he's better and that he knows better for sure. And honestly, to a degree, he may be right about at least that second part, that he knows better, because he's been around forever.
Right.
So like somebody who hasn't lived as long as he has, yeah, it's possible, but anyway, there's other ways of leading that don't do that, but still.
But yeah, it's the typical old Walker, like, too much power mindset.
And absolute power corrupts absolutely. So yeah, just being like, you know, feeling that way or whatever. I agree.
Yeah. And he's cognizant of it enough to be able to say, oh, these new Walkers are better because they're not like that. But he's not cognizant of it enough to be able to say, oh, okay, like, I don't know better than them. I shouldn't be in charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like an interesting, like, line that he's teetering in.
Yeah. In fact, speaking of that line, I'm going to skip a little bit. Teferi, in doing this time travel stuff, is kind of justifying it to himself as to why he has to do this, and kind of talking about the fact that they all discussed this, like him, Saheeli, Kaya, Joda, etc., that they came to the conclusion that this was what needed to be done. He needed to go back in time, figure out the Silex. How does it work? And kind of what he said was basically, how do I put it? He said that, like, look, if there wasn't this catastrophe going on, I wouldn't be doing this.
Right. And
then he's like, you know, that's exactly what Urza said when... And then he, like, kind of stopped, because he was like, oh. And, like, realized, like, oh, I get it. That's the bad thing that I'm doing. Because I'm just using the same justifications Urza did, and yet everybody gave Urza shit for it because...
Yeah, but again, it's like old versus new, you know, because it didn't start out that way, right? And a great number of years had to go by before Urza was thought of as this villain as opposed to this hero, right? And so it's that passing of the torch thing makes sense for that as well, because it's, I'm an old person and I'm behind on the times, you know? So I'm not as good at being accepting of all of the new stuff, right? And I don't know it as well, and I just am not acclimated to it, right?
Yeah. The story even got to take some time to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, which I appreciated because this was not one of the stories, like this story, even if it was long in terms of like number of words or whatever, it didn't feel long. This story did a good job of moving you along and giving you the information that you needed, right? You mentioned this earlier. Like giving you the information that you needed in a concise enough way where you didn't feel like you were slogging through and like going, oh my God, when is this going to be over? Like it felt like most everything that was here for a purpose and accomplished that purpose well. There's like one thing that I'll talk about in a bit that I wasn't fully sure we needed in the story, but like it's a little bit nitpicky, but I still wanted to bring it up. But the tongue-in-cheek aspect of it was Teferi talking about the Silexes. And I say Silexes, plural, not because Karn had one that was destroyed, Urza had one that was in the past that actually did the Silex Blast, and now Saheeli has one. I'm talking about because in Dominaria's past, if that wasn't recorded properly, because the only person who was alive after that blast went off was Urza, and he didn't write anything down about it. So there were legends about the Silex, there were rumors, there were stories here and there, and so Teferi kind of lists off all of the different, the number of Silexes and where they could have come from, where they were. So like Teferi's like, there were at least 4 or 5. And then he talked about what happened to them. Well, there were rumors that one ended up here, and one was destroyed, and one was put here, and one was over there. And so, but that's because...
Blasted.
That's because the old stories kind of did the same thing. There were like multiple instances of different Silexes, or at least different names for the Silex, so it could have been the same thing, but it was called something different, so like people were confused as to whether this was a new item and just another Silex, or whether it was the same thing but they were calling it something different without acknowledging its previous name as well.
Well, an artifact that's old enough, if it kind of moves around in its location a little bit, is going to be called different things by different groups of people who all of a sudden, you know, come upon this artifact. So I can see how that makes perfect sense as a parallel to actual history, right? Where like, okay, I'm in this particular city that exists. I come upon this artifact. I name it X, Y, Z.
Right. Yeah.
And then, you know, as the years go by, I move to a town that's, you know, over here, you know, 2 towns away. Now, I die, and then my offspring dies, and then their offspring loses the artifact.
Right, or pawns it, or sells it,
right,
or whatever.
And then someone else acquires it, and now they rename it something different.
Sure.
And then they have it for decades and decades, right? And so it makes perfect sense in the scheme of how things actually work in the real world. It just makes it a little hard when you're reading about it and it's a game because then you don't understand, you know, if it's the same item, if it's not, what's happened to it in its lifespan, because its lifespan is going to be different than the lifespan of a person, kind of like what I just said, right? Because it's going to pass from person to person, hands to hands, right? And end up in different places doing different things. You know, maybe somebody thought it was a nice decorative bowl and they put it on their coffee table with some fake fruit in it, you know, and you know, none the wiser. Nobody, you know, people think, oh my God, this mysterious artifact just disappeared one day. And meanwhile, this person's got it on their coffee table. You know, things like that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
They just do.
Yeah, and I mean, when these stories were around the first time, the internet was not as prominent, right? Now you can go on Reddit or check a Twitter thread or tweet at the person who's in charge of the magic story and just say like, hey, here's my question, please answer it, and like hope that they get back to you. Or, and I'm not encouraging anyone to do this, I'm just saying that it is a tactic that some people use. And again, I'm not encouraging anyone to do it, but you could pester them until they answer your question, right? Like, but what about my question though? But what about my question though? Like, so there are ways nowadays to go about it that didn't exist back then. And so if there was a lack of understanding or some misinformation, or there was a typo or somebody called it the wrong thing in an official publication or on a card, that misinformation would just spread. Because if you had somebody who read the stories meticulously and you had other people that didn't, the people that are looking at the cards and trying to determine the stories from the cards might have a completely different thought than the person who read all the novels.
Yes, big time.
Right. Or
particularly when it's novels as opposed to short stories, because there's so many more words.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so you're not going to be able to point to it and be like, oh, it was in this story that it said it. Like, it's going to be like, I don't remember that it was on page 245 in like the second paragraph. Like, no, you're not going to remember that enough. You're just going to be like, I think it was this. And so that's what I remember. And then as that gets passed around, that just becomes gospel in that particular area, right? Like you just talked about, right? And so then some other area might have a completely different idea of what the Silex is, where it came from, what its name is, what it did, where it ended up, etc. So
yeah, it's like different dialects of the Silex.
Nice.
Dialects of the Silex.
Nice. Or Silex.
I feel like that's like a name of a play.
Yeah, for sure. I wrote down a quote for myself. Usually this is an Amy thing, but I wrote down a quote for myself when Teferi was talking about where the Silex might have ended up after the fact. One of the options that was mentioned was, or tossed into a lake as a tribute to some ice-bound god.
Now, I had to ask him about that, and I'll let you just explain it.
Yes,
now,
of course. So, again, that's very tongue-in-cheek, because a trope among the Vorthos community is, and I think mostly when it was like in the lead up to Eldritch Moon, for example, when people were wondering what the big bad was going to be in Eldritch Moon when Shadows over Innistrad was out, and you saw like these weird things happening to people, but you didn't really have context for it, right? Now we know it was Emrakul, but back then we didn't know that.
She's awesome.
But back then we didn't know that. We didn't know how Emrakul was going to be able to end up on another plane. How could it have happened? Who did it? Oh, it was Nahiri? We didn't know any of that stuff during Shadows over Innistrad. So there was rampant speculation of people talking about who it could have been, what it could have been. The other thing is people talking about who the Raven Man could have been. That also has been solved. But inevitably, there will be someone, and it's almost a joke at this point, but there will still be some people who will bring it up fully seriously. But there will be people who will bring up that it's Merit Lage, the creature or creature token that is made from the Dark Depths land, because that is such a prominent combo in Legacy decks or Commander decks and things like that, that, you know, you're going to get a 2020, Flying Indestructible. I don't remember exactly what the card does. I'm not a constructed guy, but I know that it's a very good card, and you can do Thespian Stage to cheat it out, and many other ways to cheat it out, etc. But
I don't know what that is.
But basically, it's a land that copies another land that's already on the field. But because Dark Depths comes in with 20 counters on it, you have to wait till it gets down to no counters. When the Thespian Stage comes in and mirrors the Dark Depths, it doesn't come in with the counters. So then because it has no counters on it, you just get Merit Lage right then and there.
Gotcha.
So anyway, I'm glad that was a quick enough explanation, because like sometimes it's complicated. You're like, you got to play this card, and then you got to play this card. Then technically, based on the rules, it allows you to. Thankfully, that's not as difficult to explain.
And here's why that's important, because then that thing goes and does this.
Yes. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is it's never Merit Lage, and
yes.
And here it was them talking about it again, and guess what? That's not what happened to the Silex. Okay. This was the part of the story we hear about Teferi actually doing his time traveling to 85, 28, and 44 AR, which are the ones that we saw him blip into in the previous stories. 85 is when he messes with the Warlord's head, because the Warlord is like super paranoid, and Teferi shows up in his room and the guy's like screaming and paranoid and scared. 22 is when he shows up at the battlefield and the Falaji soldiers are like there dying on the ground, and the one Falaji soldier, whose name I unfortunately forget, I could flip back and look at it. You could tell me in the comments, or go back and watch our other videos where we discussed it as well, because we did talk about his name in An Ink of Empires, as well as the story prior to it, episode 3 and 4. But that Falaji soldier saw the ghost of Teferi, assumed it was death, heard him say, "Not yet," and assumed that that meant that death was not coming for him, and so he used that as motivation to live on. And then Teferi went to the other battle in 44, which was from the Ink of Empires, and he got to see the devastation from that fight as well. This story showed little snippets of that from Teferi's perspective, but there was really not much more added here. So this was kind of the only part of the story that I felt like we didn't need. Okay. Like I was like, I don't fully get why we had this, because we already knew, because we heard from Teferi in those portions of the second, third, and fourth stories, where he said at the end, "This isn't it, we got to go look somewhere else, you know, we got to figure something else out instead," or whatever. And this story didn't add much more to that. I think in the 22 AR one, it talked about the fact that a boy died reaching up for Teferi and said, like, "Father," and then died. And that's sad. I don't believe that was something that we heard in 22 from the Falaji soldier's perspective, because I think he was a little busy dying. Yeah. And then eventually survives, but still. But otherwise, I don't know. I just, like, I was waiting to hear Teferi's, like, or, you know, get Teferi's thought process or opinions during that time, and I feel like it didn't happen. And so it was like, all right. So at the end of it, it was like, so then what was the point of doing this? I didn't fully get that. Okay. Again, that is not me saying, wow, the story sucked, I can't believe that. No. Story's still great. That one portion, like I said, maybe a little nitpicky, but I don't know why it was fully included. If this was the final story of like a 12-story arc, and these Teferi having gone back in time was in episodes 2, 3, and 4, and now this is episode 12, yeah, you might want to do the little flashback. But seeing as how stories 2, 3, and 4 came out less than a week prior to when this story came out, you don't really need the recap if it's just for the sake of a recap to remind people about it. That's just me. If you disagree, as always, leave it in the comments down below.
Yeah, I mean, that didn't occur to me at all, so I'm kind of glad you brought it up.
Oh, okay.
That didn't occur to me at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote, like, I just don't know if we needed this part. There wasn't much to it. Like, there was barely any new information shared. It was fully duplicative, I felt. Okay. Compared to what we heard from the other stories, because the other stories gave those a couple of paragraphs, a couple of sections of, or like the end section of those 3 stories was, okay, now we'll flash ahead to Teferi and hear what's, or, you know, see what's going on with Teferi finding these particular areas. This gave it drastically less time than that, and we didn't get to hear Teferi's perspective and thoughts and etc. any different from what we saw. That's all. That's why. Then Teferi finally finds where he's supposed to be going. Sees the Silex blast happen, leaves, comes back, and then we get that awesome moment. And again, you mentioned earlier that I don't think there's a lot of analysis to do for this particular part, but what I'll say is if you read no other part of the story, you should read the conversation between Urza and Teferi in that, like, void space.
Yeah.
Because
cool.
That was incredible. I really liked that a lot. Again, gave a lot of information. There was some character development there as well. You got to see from Urza and Teferi. There was like some cool descriptions of how Urza was, because he's an old walker, his body was like, I don't want to say decomposing, that's a very specific thing, but kind of falling apart. It kind of was, yeah. But like burning away and falling apart, and then reforming itself. And then burning away and falling apart, and then reforming itself. And that all of that is going on while he's just having seemingly a casual conversation and still being himself, despite the fact that his body is collapsing over and over again.
It's like, I'm having a conversation with you as I'm turning to ash.
Yeah, for sure.
And then I come back to life, and then I continue having my conversation with you. It's the weirdest fucking thing.
Yes. Now there is a bit, I said there wasn't a lot of metaphor in here, and I still believe there isn't, but there were some quotes that you asked me to write down that may fall a bit into that category. So the first, and this is all Teferi and Urza talking to one another. Teferi says, "Time does not pass like the hand of a clock. It's already happening."
Right. Yeah. People assign things to time a lot.
Okay.
Right? And I think Teferi's point in all of this was to say that the things that are assigned to time are not indicative of time, right? Time is its own entity that's not really as linear or as boxed in as we force it to be, right? Mm-hmm. It's a lot more fluid than that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, speaking of fluid, the analogy that he uses is the river, right? That time flows like a river. I mean, I've heard that analogy a million times. I'm sure that's why they used it that way, because... And yet he's able to talk about, like, you know, okay, let's assume that time flows like a river. What about branch-offs? What about it just stopping at some points, right? Because it
stuck behind a rock or whatever.
Yeah, it gets too slowed, and so it just cuts off. What about when it lets out into a lake, and then that lake is just self-contained? And that's what he said. He said that he and Urza were in a lake of time because it was stationary. It wasn't moving and flowing. And
it was something that they could kind of drop on into, sort of separate and apart from that river.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. Yeah, and then eventually they get found, right? Because they stayed there too long, it says. And so some black, like, shadowy fingers come through the sky, for lack of a better term, because it's a void, but, like, above them, to kind of overtake them and remove them from that space.
Fate's hand decided to...
basically.
To take back the power from the too powerful planeswalkers. Not two, but... T-O-O.
Yes. The next section you wanted me to talk about, or that you wanted to talk about, excuse me, was when Teferi is looking at the Silex that Urza is holding. There's light coming out of the Silex, and Teferi looks at it and feels that the light from the Silex was doom. And the quote was, "He was staring at the end of one age and the dawn of another."
Which is so cool. When you read that line, I was like, oh, I want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to be separate enough from time and what is happening and culture and history enough to be able to be in a place where I can see the change occur from the outside, right? Because a lot of times when you're in it and there's a huge political shift or a huge cultural shift or something like that, because you're in it, you don't feel how much of a shift that is. Because you just kind of walk it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But somebody looking on at it from the outside would be able to see the distance that you had to move, right? In a way that you couldn't as you were in it and moving yourself. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I was going to say another good analogy for it is growing old. that if you spend every day with someone for years, their progression, if you look at a photo, might be very obvious, like, or it might be like drastic, right? You look at a photo of someone from 5 years ago and a photo of someone today, and you're like, wow, you look super different. But if you're with them every day, you're witnessing the change. So you're not going to say, wow, you look super different because you saw them yesterday.
Right.
So that progression is different. Whereas if an old friend shows up who hasn't seen them in 5 or 10 years, they're going to be like, oh my God, you got so old, you're gray, you've lost weight, you've gained weight, whatever it is, because they're seeing first snippet, last snippet. You're seeing it every single day along the way, and so you don't notice that change because to you it's so gradual that it occurs. So, yeah, I think I was thinking of that when you were talking about it. So, when you asked if it made sense, that's another way to look at it as well, right? So, that moment of, like I said, of Urza and Teferi talking to one another, incredible. Take the time, read it, it's super good. And then I think the second best, again, you have like good, cool character moments. The second best would be Urza and Tawnos talking towards the end. That one was a lot more somber, I feel, and a lot more reflective or reverent of the situation that they're in and what they just went through. And I say just, it was 5 years prior, but still, for Tawnos, it might as well have been just because he was in a coffin the whole time. And then, did you have more? Did I cut you off from the Urza stuff? Okay. No. The Urza and Teferi stuff. And then, kind of Tawnos, like Urza just kind of says, I have to go. And Tawnos is like, well, we're going to need you. You know, we've got a lot of stuff coming up. And Urza's like, I have to go. And so he goes. And again, to me, it was very somber. It was very sad. Because these two, like, friends this relationship that these two had was so different now. And you could tell that they just knew that in that conversation with one another. And, yeah. And Urza just having to go. And yet saying to Tawnos, I was your teacher. You were my student for so long. Now you get to go be a teacher.
Right. And
we know that Tawnos does go and do that. He does so with Ashnod, right? They start their school together. But that, and again, it was just, that moment was very sad. And then you see Tawnos kind of walk off to then go to episode 1, which we reviewed already, which was the first of these stories, the Brothers War main stories, where he meets up with Kayla, and Kayla's pissed off at him, and whatever, and he fakes his own death, blah, 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 blah. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Right? And it, again, for a story about time travel, at least to a degree, the fact that it ends right before it begins, that's real good. That's real good. I like that a lot. Super well done. And again, I'm genuinely impressed. Not because I doubt the abilities of Miguel Lopez, Jeff Grubb, or anybody else involved in this. I just was very impressed by the fact that none of the time travel stuff in this story felt confusing.
Right.
Despite, like I said, at least 7 unique time periods, including one out of time. 7 unique time periods that never felt jumbled.
Right.
Because I could be like, oh yeah, okay, 44 was this time, 69 was this time, 85 was this time. I remembered them from the prior stories, and I was able to keep them straight in my mind so that they didn't get jumbled up and confusing.
They also didn't feel unnatural and forced and alien. Because I feel like there are a lot of times where you have a time travel plot line that really gets that way. Because of how many times people are going back and forth, or the types of things that they're doing or whatever, or the effect that it has on the people who are affected by it, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think this was a lot more structured than that, and like compartmentalized, which made it easy to, like you said, sort of understand what they were doing with it, but also left it free enough for it to be the kind of thing where it's like the end is just before the beginning.
Yeah. Super good.
Because it's proving its own point by doing that, right? That time isn't a linear, only one direction facing, moving thing.
Yep.
It's a lot more complex than that. And so you got the feel of the complexity while also having it be organized enough to keep you from getting lost in the shuffle of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so super well done. We obviously, like I said, we have one more side story left, which is like present day story. And I don't think you know this, Amy, but I, from looking at story spotlight cards and talking about them or watching other people talk about them or whatever, I'm very interested to see what they're doing in the next story that we're about to review.
Yeah.
Because we need to see what's going on there. And like I said, that video will be out on Monday, come hell or high water. And then honestly, December 1st, we have something special. It will be another JaAR. It will not be about the Brothers War. And I highly encourage you to watch it because we're looking forward to making it. And we hope that you're looking forward to watching it. We are being vague on purpose. But I, again, encourage you, as I said, to subscribe and ring that bell so that you will get that notification as soon as that video comes out. It should be a good one, so I encourage you to watch. Anything else for this story?
No. It was just good.
Yes, agreed. And if you disagree, I want to know why. Truly. Not because I think you're wrong. I want to hear from you, right? Your opinion is just as valid as ours, and I want to know why you disliked it if you did. Or if there were other moments that you disliked that we didn't touch on, or something like that. Any and all of those things, leave it down in the comments below. Because I think that reading a story and being able to say, oh my god, this story was amazing, but still being willing to seek out or listen to folks who were like, actually, I didn't like it because X, Y, and Z. Right. I honestly think that's a great way for all of you to join us as we show off our
Hashtag Vorthos Pride.
Keep it going. Happy Thanksgiving to all who celebrate. Hopefully you got to spend some time with loved ones, whatever that means. Whether that mean over the phone, video chat, or in person. And if you are outside of the United States, think of something that you're thankful for. Tell someone that you love them today. It's important. It's great. We love you and we appreciate each and every one of you for being here. So thank you for taking the time. And we hope that you enjoyed as always. But we will, like I said, we'll be back on Monday. So we will see you then with JaAR. But of course, we've got more stuff on all of our channels. So definitely check them out. Links down in the description box below. But for now, from us here at the Geek for All family of channels, I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.